way, but welcome and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Courtney Newman and I'm the co-chair of the Global Youth Caucus. I'm normally based in Cologne, Germany, but currently I'm in Colorado, and this is also the state that I vote from. We are so pleased to welcome you all to our virtual climate strike. Climate change is the biggest threat facing humanity, and urgent action is needed to prevent further devastating impacts, but also to address the issue of climate justice, which we will be talking about more today. Younger generations are the one who will pay the price if we fail to act now. But as the Global Youth Caucus, we really believe that the youth have the ability to affect real and meaningful change. We believe that our voices matter, and it's about time that we make them heard, or continue making them heard, right? As a studying environmental scientist myself, I care deeply for all things climate change, so I'm particularly excited to hear from our guest speakers today. We will be introducing them to you shortly. I'm also pleased to be joined by a few others from the Global Youth Caucus Steering Committee, including Sydney, Miguel, and our other co-chair, Alex, if you guys just want to wave so everyone knows who you are, thanks. And they'll have the opportunity to introduce themselves in a bit as well. A few housekeeping items before we really get started. Please remember to just remain muted throughout the call and while others are speaking. Miguel will also be monitoring the chat box, which can be found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So throughout the event, if you have a question, you can either type the question directly into the chat box, or oftentimes in DA, we type * hand up, and you will be put into the queue, and Miguel will keep track of the queue. And then you can ask your question during the live Q&A session after all of the 3 speakers have spoken. So Miguel, you're good to go with that.
All right, thank you, Courtney. And I'm, as Courtney said, I'm Alex. I'm the other co-chair of the Global Youth Caucus. I live in Brussels at the moment, and I am from and I vote in Los Angeles, California. In solidarity with the global movement to push more visibility on climate change and climate action, we are striking today to demand climate justice. And those of you who know me will be tired of hearing this, but it needs to be said over and over. This decade will be marked by a massive transfer of power and wealth. The National Young Farmers Coalition projects that 2/3 of the US's farmland will switch hands alone, not to mention all of the wealth and other stations that will change hands as well. A number of 2030 climate deadlines are fast approaching and will not be attained by the goals that are currently set by our administration and industry leaders. We are so excited to have many of you here to strike with us to support the efforts being made to make sure that this responsibility falls and finds its way into the right hands. This is the kind of energy and action we need to see more of. Today, we have 3 special climate activists who will be speaking with us. First, we will hear from Sam Goodman, a senior communications officer at La Ruta del Clima. He will be speaking with us about the importance of the US being back in the Paris Agreement. Next up will be Naomi Aegis. Will speak to us about what we need to demand from world leaders in order to see climate action. And just for her background, she is an attorney, campaigner, and head of the Democrats Abroad Climate Action Team. And last but certainly not least, we will hear from Michelle Dietrich, founder and the chair of the first ever DNC Environment and Climate Crisis Council. She will be speaking to us about specific short-term climate binding targets and policies that address justice and equity. I'm going to pass it on to Sydney.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sydney, and I'm a member of the Global Youth Caucus Steering Committee. I live in Bogota, Colombia, but I vote in Suffolk County, New York, where I currently am right now. I'm very excited to hear from our speakers today, but to start us off, we have a special video we'd like to share. This video was made by Sophie Liu, an 8-year-old climate change activist who lives in Bonn, Germany. She often participates in local Democrats Abroad Germany events with her dad, Yifeng Liu, who is a member of the AAPI Caucus Steering Committee. We were excited and inspired by Sophie's activism, so without further ado, here is her video.
Hi, my name is Sophie. I'm 8 years old and I care about the climate. People don't listen to me when I'm by myself. But if every kid screams and shouts together, no one can ignore us. What do we want? Climate action! When do we want it? Now! Let's make them listen to us on Friday at a global climate strike. Wir sind hier, wir sind laut, weil ihr uns die Zukunft klaut. Wir sind hier, wir sind laut, weil ihr uns die Zukunft klaut.
Well, I heard the video was good and I enjoyed it even more than I expected to. So let's round of applause for Sophie. And Sophie, can you give us a wave so we can all see you? Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Sophie. That was for all your hard work and that great message. We are in desperate need of a meaningful and swift climate change, and hope that if we work together, we can find solutions and make necessary changes. And I'm going to pass
That's just such a great video. Thank you so much, Sophie. It's great to see somebody younger than the Youth Caucus in this call. So, so thank you everybody for joining and being here today. My name is Jose Miguel Madrigal Hidalgo, but you can just call me Miguel. I live in Costa Rica, and I vote I'm a proud Buckeye State voter. I am from Columbus, Ohio. So now we will be moving into the speaker section of the event. As a reminder, if you have a question, please type the question directly into the chat box or type star hand up in the chat box to be put in the queue, and you can ask your question live during the Q&A. I am excited to introduce our first guest speaker for today, Sam Goodman. Sam has over 13 years of experience working with climate change and natural resource management in the public, private, and NGO sectors. He is currently a senior communications officer at La Ruta del Clima, a Costa Rican NGO that focuses on citizen participation in climate change governance. He holds dual master's degrees in natural resources and sustainable development and international affairs. So, and he's a personal friend of mine. So, Sam, I am so honored and excited to introduce you today. Are you ready to take it away?
I am.
That's a yes. Okay, good.
Let me.
All yours. The floor is yours, Sam.
Sounds good. Okay, so I'll be talking today a little bit about Biden, the new administration, and what comes next for international climate diplomacy. So just to give you a little bit of background on the current state of climate diplomacy, let's talk about what is the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement is a historical environmental agreement that was adopted by almost all nations in 2015 to address climate change and its negative effects. And as you probably all know, Barack Obama's administration joined the Paris Agreement. Trump withdrew from Paris, and President Joe Biden moved to rejoin the agreement on day one of his administration. So this aims to prevent global temperatures from increasing more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And with the US back in the fold, every nation in the world has now signed the Paris Agreement. And then looking at going back a few years to look at the Barack Obama administration, this was some really important times for climate diplomacy. During the presidency of Barack Obama, the United States emerged as a global leader on international climate diplomacy. So the US joined the Paris Agreement. It submitted its first nationally determined contribution, which is its plan to reduce emissions and adapt for climate change to the Paris Agreement. And also Obama made its first major climate finance commitments, pledging $3 billion to the Green Climate Fund. Also under Obama, the Clean Power Plan aimed to reduce carbon dioxide emissions from electrical power generation 32% by 2030 from its 2005 levels, and his EPA greatly improved fuel efficiency standards. I would say it wasn't all great. Obama's all of the above energy strategy was fairly destructive for the president. His now infamous speech, his now infamous speech, he said, "You wouldn't always know it, but it went up every year I was president. Suddenly America's like the biggest oil producer and the biggest gas. This was me, people." And following Obama was obviously Trump and his destructive environmental agenda. Trump announced his intent to withdraw from the Paris Agreement on June 1st, 2017. The US did not formally exit the Paris Agreement until November 4th, 2020, the day after the presidential elections. Trump issued unprecedented assault on environmental laws, rules, and regulations, rolling back or reversing over 100 environmental rules and regulations. Furthermore, crude oil and natural gas production increased significantly under Trump as his administration committed to unleashing energy dominance. In 2018, carbon dioxide emissions rose 3%. This was the biggest increase since 2010, although in the last 2 years, greenhouse gas emissions in the US have fallen somewhat significantly. They dropped in 2019, primarily due to a decline in coal production, a 19% decline that year, and they fell even further in 2020, about 9% from the coronavirus pandemic and economic recession. So you can see here, US natural gas production increased significantly, both in the final years of the Obama administration and considerably under Trump before taking a bit of a nosedive in 2020 with the ongoing pandemic. The same has occurred for domestic oil production and increased significantly before falling off in last year, but slowly ramping up once again. In his infamous withdrawal speech, Paris Agreement withdrawal speech in 2017, Trump proclaimed, "I was elected by the citizens of Pittsburgh, not Paris." So in comes Biden with a pretty comprehensive, it's the most comprehensive climate plan of any modern presidential candidate or at least in the general election. So his accelerated plan to spend $2 trillion over 4 years to build a modern, sustainable infrastructure and an equitable, clean energy future is the second plank of his Build Back Better plan. The core of Biden's agenda is setting the United States on an irreversible path toward net zero emissions economy-wide. And Biden has also committed to charting a path forward to a carbon pollution-free power sector by 2035. And this is much more ambitious than even what Obama was proposing in the final year of his administration, with his strategy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 80% by 2050. This is looking at net zero rather than the 80% figure that Obama had proposed. And the US must move quickly and must move swiftly. As the famous climatologist Michael Mann from Penn State University put it, let's be clear, we need to bring down carbon emissions down to net zero within a couple of decades, and we need to bring them halfway there within the next decade. That requires massive action on our part and on the part of every country in the world. So what has Biden done? He hasn't even been in office 2 months yet, but he's been making several steps forward. On day one of the administration, he moved to rejoin the Paris Agreement. He also halted oil and gas development in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. He revoked the Keystone Pipeline permit, paused new oil and gas leases on federal public land, so there will not be any lease sales conducted through the Bureau of Land Management. Also in the recently signed $1.9 trillion COVID relief package, this includes $100 million reserved for the EPA to address air pollution and environmental health risks. So there's already been a lot of movement in the last couple of days. Biden's putting his team together. For the first time ever, he has appointed dual domestic and international climate czars. On the international side, you have John Kerry, the special presidential envoy for climate. So he's expected to be leading the delegation at this year's climate conference. And on the domestic side, you have Gina McCarthy, who was the EPA administrator under Obama and more recently ran the Natural Resources Defense Council. And she's been appointed as the first ever White House National Climate Advisor. Other key posts, it's the Secretary of State. You have Tony Blinken, Secretary of Interior, Deb Haaland, the EPA Administrator, Michael Reagan, and nominated for the Chair of the Council of Environmental Equality is Brenda Malloy. So one of the most important things that Biden is going to be having to do is submit a revised nationally determined contribution. So nationally determined contributions are essentially the heart of the Paris Agreement. They represent each country's commitment to reduce its emissions and adapt to the effects of climate change to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. The United States is expected to submit a more ambitious NDC to the Paris Agreement, possibly have this year's UN Climate Conference, COP26 in Glasgow. And the first NDC, which was submitted in 2016 under Obama, commits the United States to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions 26 to 28% by 2025 from its 2005 levels. So this is a decent start, but it's nowhere where we need to be. And the big issue with the proposed revised nationally determined contribution is what is the U.S. targets for 2030. So to be in line with the science and the latest IPCC report, many environmental groups are pushing for a 50% reduction in emissions by 2030 from 2005 levels. So it still remains to be seen if the Biden administration is up for such an ambitious target. So COP26 is going to be this year, hopefully. The delegation is actually is currently in Costa Rica right now. So 2020 was supposed to be a landmark year for climate ambitions, with nations submitting the revised NDCs ahead of COP26 in Glasgow. With the pandemic pushing back the conference to November 2021, only a few countries have submitted their new pledges, and a lot of them have been relatively lackluster, to be honest. And the US return to the Paris Agreement will be critical to this year's negotiations. So it's going to be front and center. This is one of the most important COPs since COP21, where the Paris Agreement came out of. And one of the other key issues in terms of international climate diplomacy is climate finance. So climate finance refers to local, national, or transnational financing drawn from public, private, and alternative sources of financing that seeks to support mitigation and adaptation actions that will address climate change. So climate finance from wealthy nations increased from $54 billion in 2017 to $62 billion in 2018. And during the Obama years, Obama pledged $3 billion to the Green Climate Fund, which is one of the major finance institutions. The US only made good on $1 billion of these $3 billion commitments before Trump reneged on the final $2 billion. So Kerry's been, as the international climate czar, he's been pretty adamant about the US making good on the country's finance pledges. But $3 billion is not nearly enough. The idea is there's $100 billion to have $100 billion of global climate finance per year from wealthy nations. So as Joe Thwaites at the World Resource Institute Sustainable Finance Center put it, there is a strong expectation from both developing countries and partners in Europe that the US would go further to make up for lost time. Last year, developed countries made a new round of pledges to the Green Climate Fund. Many of them doubled their contributions. There will be some pressure on the Biden administration to match this level of funding. So Kerry says they'll make good on their climate finance pledges, but will they increase the finance? Will they work towards meeting the $100 billion goal that was established during the Copenhagen COP? Some other key issues in terms of international climate diplomacy that Biden will be involved in. He will host the Global Leaders Summit on Earth Day, April 22nd. The goal is to collectively raise climate ambition among major greenhouse gas emitters. This also will occur on the same day as the 5th anniversary of the US signing ceremony for the Paris Agreement. So Biden's push to have the US once again lead in climate diplomacy has been a welcome change by many world leaders. As Justin Trudeau put it, US leadership has been sorely missed over the last few years. One of the more interesting aspects of Biden's climate plan is he will institute a new global climate change report to hold countries to account for meeting or failing to meet their Paris commitments and for other steps to promote or undermine global climate solutions. So what kind of world leaders could be labeled climate outlaws. I think first and foremost, you have Jair Bolsonaro, president of Brazil. You could also have Putin in Russia. If the Biden administration is feeling a bit bold, they can even maybe attack, MBS and the Saudis. But we'll see who gets dubbed as these so-called climate outlaws. One of the other things that Biden has promised to do is reform his approach to G7 and G20. So once again, the Group of Seven is an intergovernmental organization consisting of Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And G20 is an international forum for governments and central bank governors of 19 of the world's largest economies, as well as the European Union. So Biden plans to make climate change a priority, and working with G7 and G20 leaders, this represents a major departure from the Trump administration. And in his plan, Biden pledges to seek a G20 commitment to end all export finance subsidies of high carbon projects and eliminate financing for coal in all but the poorest countries. So G7, his revised approach to G7 and G20 will be a central part of his international climate agenda. One of the other key issues is China and the US bilateral relations. This is critical because these two nations combine for 43% of total carbon dioxide emissions. So we need to establish a constructive dialogue among the world's two largest greenhouse gas emitters. And Biden is really big on this in his climate plan. So in its plan, he proposed future bilateral US-China agreements on carbon mitigation, like the 2014 agreement that paved the way for the Paris Accord, contingent upon China eliminating unjustified export subsidies for coal and other high emissions technologies, and making verifiable progress in reducing the carbon footprint of projects connected to the Belt and Road Initiative. And this really kicked off yesterday with a contentious meeting between Secretary of State Antony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan with top Chinese foreign diplomats in Alaska yesterday. And this was the first major meeting between the two nations since Biden assumed office. And that's what I have prepared for you today. And thanks again, Miguel, for the introduction.
Okay. Thank you so much, Sam. Wait, give me a. Yeah, please do.
Thank you, Sam. That was great.
Okay. So did he stop sharing his screen?
I still see it.
Okay. Well. Okay, perfect. We're back into the main room. So thank you so much, Sam. Thank you so much. I think he deserves a round of applause. Yay. So now that the U.S. is back in the Paris Agreement, I think we have a lot to look forward to. However, as voters, there is still much work to be done. As our first call to action, we ask you to write your representatives right now after this climate strike and demand they support environmental policies and fight for climate action and climate justice. Writing to your representatives is a great way to make your voices heard on issues that are important to you, like climate change. To make this easier on you, we have prepared a pre-written letter that can be edited accordingly and sent along to your representatives. You can find the link to this pre-written letter in the chat box. Please join us in writing your representatives and pressuring them to support environmental policies that address climate change and climate justice. Thank you.
Fun. Thank you for that, Miguel. Our next speaker is Naomi Aegis. She's an attorney and campaigner committed to climate justice, human rights, and smashing the patriarchy. She leads the Democrats Abroad Climate Action Team from Oslo, Norway, where she is currently raising a puppy and looking for her next hike. She is here today to speak with us more about what we must demand from our world leaders in order to see the climate action that we need. Naomi, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. I'm going to attempt to share this presentation that I have. Okay, going to present mode here. I've never presented from Canva before to Zoom, so fingers crossed. Can everybody see that? Just a thumbs up. Fantastic. So yes, my name is Naomi. I am in Oslo, Norway, and I am presenting on the demands for world leaders related to this particular climate strike. And I've taken inspiration from the Fridays for Future activists, but these demands were here before and they will continue to be important. And it's certainly not, sorry if you can hear that noise in the background, it's the pandemic puppy that I mentioned in my bio, and he is chewing an enormous rawhide bone, but it's the only way to keep him from jumping on screen. So it's either noise or puppy interruption. So I apologize. So yeah, I am based in Oslo and I vote in New Jersey, where I grew up, although I was born in Canada and I have dual passports. So during the last couple years of the Trump administration, I often leaned on my Canadian citizenship when he would do something particularly egregious in relation to the climate or environment or anything else living internationally. But I'm starting to admit again that I am also an American citizen. And so, sorry, I'm just making sure nobody's chatting to me. Puppy interruption. If he really comes over and behaves himself, I'll put him on screen. So, I was hoping that we could just do a really quick icebreaker so people on the call could have a chance to be a little interactive, which is, this is technically a climate strike, which is not the same as a protest, but certainly related. And so I thought people might want to drop into the chat what their first protest or strike was. In the little picture that in my presentation, my shirt says "Reject Rex," and that was when I was in the Capitol protesting against Rex Tillerson being nominated for Secretary of State at his confirmation hearings. So an unsuccessful protest, but a necessary one. And my first protest was in 9th grade when we protested the Disney store at the Bridgewater Mall, because at that point in time, the Disney store was accused of using child labor to produce their goods. So my social studies teacher rounded us all up and took us to the mall, where we sat outside the Disney store with our signs and chants. And I have not stopped protesting, striking since then. So maybe people want to write in where their first protest was, or maybe this is it, which is very cool too. Nice. BLM. Very cool. These are great. I hope everybody's reading the chat box. But just in case you're not, we have the Million Mom March for gun control when somebody was 2 years old, the Women's March, in high school for a teachers union, a Divest from South Africa rally, in DC against Prop 8, classic, against CAFTA. It's a free trade agreement, another site of many protests around the world for the free trade agreements that do nothing for the environment or labor. Just give it a couple more minutes so people can read these. My most recent protest was BLM protest as well. So I was lucky enough to be able to be back in the US during the November election and the lead up to it. And so I was able to participate in some actions there. Okay, so I'll move on to the meat of my presentation, which is to say that I'm flattered that Courtney invited me to be here today. I am not young, obviously, for the Global Youth Caucus, but I hope that I'm an ally, and I hope that people are inspired by what the Youth Caucus is organizing in concert with what's happening all over the world. And I just did a quick screen grab of the map this morning for how many events were organized today. And this doesn't really even do it justice. If you zoomed in on any of these, there's dozens and dozens that aren't shown, but this is truly a global movement. And so I think it's exciting that Democrats abroad is getting involved in this. And I think it's important that we keep in mind that in all the demands that are made on the US as the largest historical emitter of carbon comes with a lot of responsibility to the countries where a lot of these actions are taking place and where a lot of youth activists are rising up, because the impacts are disproportionately felt there. And the responsibility is on countries like the US, Canada, Europe, the nations that have benefited the most from fossil fuel use and extraction. So I just thought it would be grounding for us to see where people are demanding climate action and to remind us, I hope, why everybody's here. And this next slide is so that you can see that I'm not young. It's to prove that I was in Paris in 2015 when the agreement was signed. And that little arrow is of the shortest person in the room is me with my team. I was working for Greenpeace at the time. And we are in that, somebody captured a photo of the entire team reading the then leaked final text on the last night of the negotiations in Paris. And we were analyzing what did and did not make it into the text in terms of the demands that civil society and NGOs had made of the governments and negotiators for the agreement. And Sam just gave us a good overview of what was in the Paris Agreement and what wasn't. And so the sort of most important point now is that the biggest get in the agreement in the minds of civil society at the time was the 1.5 degree temperature goal. That was actually a pretty big surprise considering the language had been 2 degrees, under 2 degrees, but to have the actual 1.5 temperature target named in the Paris Agreement was a pretty big deal, and really showed the urgency and scale that would be needed by the countries to achieve that target. And that was a night of celebration and hope and tiredness and sort of disbelief that it actually happened. And unfortunately, since then, it's been a bit glacial and disappointing in climate progress. And so I think that's why one of the reasons the strike today, the hashtag for it, is no more empty promises. Because I'm just quoting one of the leaders of the youth strike here, and you can read her quote, you don't need me to read it to you. But there's a lot of talk and there's a lot of reports put out, and there's a lot of future dates, 2030, 2050, net zero, carbon neutral. But that doesn't mean anything for the reality of what's happening right now. And I've just cherry picked a little bit some facts for why this progress has been disappointing and how things are not progressing how they should be in terms of achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement and in terms of achieving climate justice and equity. So I'll highlight in Norway, which is where I'm based, the government, the major oil company in Norway is now private, but used to be state-owned and still intertwined with the Norwegian government. And they were sued for trying to drill in pristine Arctic waters further north than any company or any oil has ever been extracted before. And the Norwegian constitution has a right to a provision saying that citizens have a right to a clean environment. And a group of citizens and NGOs sued the government saying that drilling in the Arctic was incompatible with that right. And a court found that although the right exists and is substantive, it shouldn't prohibit a government from drilling for oil in Arctic waters. So just a complete disconnect between Norway being seen as a green leader and progressive, and Oslo being the green capital of the world for 2020, and a commitment to extracting and exporting and making money off oil. A new study released showed that in 2018, 8.7 million more deaths were linked to fossil fuel emissions than would have been without the trajectory. And that's people that are already vulnerable. That's children, that's people with underlying conditions, that's disproportionately distributed among least developed global South countries who don't have the health infrastructure and don't have the protections from fossil fuel extraction and burning. I don't have to remind everybody on this call about the brush fires in Australia and the burning of the Amazon in Brazil, but both of those countries are signatories to the Paris Agreement. But Australia is trying to increase its coal exports. And Brazil is obviously, as Sam mentioned, has Jair Bolsonaro as its president, who is actively opposed to an environmental agenda and wants to open up the Amazon to more development, but is a signatory to Paris. And so, as Sam already mentioned, virtually no countries are on track to meet their commitments under the Paris Agreement. And some countries have submitted their new revised NDCs, their nationally determined contributions, which says how much they will reduce emissions by and when, but it's just 1% more than what they promised in 2015. So Paris was great, but we're nowhere near where we need to be. And the responsibility for that is on certain countries and certain governments and certain corporations, much more than it is on others. So now these are the demands from the youth climate strikers, and I'll just go, and I can consider ourselves among them. These are our demands, not somebody else's. But I wanted to briefly go through what they mean and why they're so important. And so these demands are, I would say, mostly aimed at governments, corporations, and citizens in global north and developed countries. There's a principle in climate action, climate negotiations, known as common but differentiated responsibility. And that can be interpreted by lawyers to mean many different things, but in my opinion, it means if you have historically emitted the most emissions, then you have the most responsibility to clean them up and to pay for mitigation, adaptation, and resilience in the countries that did not cause the climate crisis, even if right now some of those countries emit more than, say, the US does. Historically, the US is the biggest emitter, and historically, the US and Canada, Europe have benefited the most from fossil fuel extraction, production, and all of the societal developments that come with that. So the first demand is to end all investments in fossil fuel exploration and extraction. It's self-explanatory. I don't think that we need to go into why that's important. But as Greta Thunberg is famous for saying, when the house is on fire, you put out the fire. You don't, start looking for alternative solutions to firefighting, and you don't start moving into a new house. You put out the fire. And that's what we need to do right now. One NGO found that governments provide support to oil, gas, and coal companies to the tune of $444 billion a year in investments, subsidies, and other sort of tax breaks. And those are concentrated in the most developed, richest countries. So it's very profitable to be a fossil fuel corporation. And it is very advantageous for them to encourage governments to protect them and continue giving them those types of tax breaks and investments. The next demand is the binding carbon budgets based on the best available science to keep warming to 1.5 degrees. And so nearly every scenario that gets us to 1.5 assumes that carbon dioxide will be removed from the air, carbon capture in whatever form that is. But right now, there are no projects that do that at scale. There are some net zero commitments that rely on things like forestry. But right now, those forests would have to be so big, there's not enough land in the world to use for that type of carbon capture. So this demand is basically, we need to be realistic about when we're setting carbon budgets, and we need to say we're going to get to 1.5 without outlandish solutions that don't have a workable process right now. Oh, I see a hand up. Did I miss that? I'm sorry.
Yep. Can I just interject? I really like your talk so far. It's you bring up some really important points. As someone that actually also works on or is working on a atmospheric carbon dioxide capture project, and I would say that also one of the concerns is without a carbon tax, there's no way that these projects can become profitable. And this is also kind of one of the problems. Of course, there aren't solutions at scale for carbon dioxide capture. I do think that, of course, these projects are exotic, but another reason I think for actually pushing for a carbon tax, again, is to support these initiatives, because you can't scale them unless you have a business or market for them. And clean energy needs to have a market as well. You can't give subsidies to fossil fuels as well.
Right. Yeah, and like there's a flip side to all of this, is with ending investments in fossil fuel exploration and extraction, those investments can be put into clean energy, into scaling carbon capture and storage. You know, this is this is surface level and trying to reflect the demands of the strikers, but I am not making a value judgment about carbon capture and storage itself. I think the demand is, don't rely on solutions that aren't scalable when we know there's things we need to do right now that could get us a lot closer to 1.5 than saying in the future we'll be able to suck all this carbon out of the air, so it's fine for Exxon to emit as much as they want for now. That's a very oversimplified description of what's happening. So the last two really quickly, I won't go into the ecocide because that's a bit separate from the things related to fossil fuel emissions and fossil fuel extraction. But I think the other two points about safeguarding democratic spaces and climate policies considering the welfare of workers and the most vulnerable get to the equity part of climate justice and the Fighters for Future and the climate strikes, which is there will be winners and losers in the massive transition that's coming, and there will be injustices based on who gets access to renewable energy, who gets access to mitigation technology, who gets access to the things that are necessary to adapt to and mitigate and move forward from the climate crisis and into a future powered by a different kind of energy. And so if vulnerable people aren't centered, then we will have the same injustices and the same inequalities in the planet that we have now. Just because we solve the climate crisis in terms of energy doesn't mean that all of the other injustices will be solved. And so it's important when designing these policies that to make sure that governments are taking into account who is most impacted right now and who will be most impacted in the future. And one thing that I like to remind myself and others when we participate in these actions is that it's a privilege to be able to strike from your computer or from your office. It was a privilege to work for Greenpeace and be a professional activist in some senses of the word. A lot of the people that these demands are for and about take their lives and livelihoods at risk to demand things like climate justice and demand the action that governments need to take. And so those people should be at the center of the policies that come through in NDCs that governments put forward in order to solve the climate crisis. And so the last slide I wanted to share, what's happening here, there is just a cartoon sort of making fun of the EU, which likes to pat itself on the back a lot for its climate policies and, sort of sees itself as an example for the world of how sustainable it is and how much more advanced they are in terms of energy. But there's all these things that they don't want you to look at that actually are impeding climate progress. And you could replace the EU there with any of the global North countries, and it would be the same baggage that is keeping us from the Paris Agreement climate goals. So I will end the presentation there. Again, thanks for inviting me, Courtney, and Global Youth Caucus. I'm so excited Democrats Abroad is participating in this, and a little plug to join the climate action team if you want to get involved in that as well, and see if you can nudge some of your governments to take on some of this work.
Thank you, Naomi. That was really great. We appreciate you being here with us to share such useful information. Climate change impacts all of us as American citizens living throughout the world. We must remember that wherever we are, we still have a duty to ourselves and future generations to fight and demand climate action. Last, but certainly not least, we have Michelle Dietrich here with us. She is founder and chair of the first ever DNC Environment and Climate Crisis Council, and she advocates for the adoption of bold, science-based climate and environmental policy nationally, at the national level and in the Democratic Party. She is a policy analyst, editor, and internationally honored poet. She is a member of UAW Local 2230 and the National Writers Union, and a delegate to her Regional Labor Federation. She is the chair of the Ann Arbor Women's March and serves on the Climate Powers National Advisory Board and the SE Michigan Land Conservancy's Board of Directors and several other boards. Michelle is a recent county commissioner in a district she flipped to red to blue and a former Peace Corps volunteer in Kenya. She lives on her family's 80-acre farm in Southeast Michigan, and we are delighted to have her speak with us today about the very important topic of climate change and the targets and policies that address justice and equity. Michelle, please take it away.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be here. And thank you, Alex and Courtney and Miguel and Sydney for organizing. And it is an incredible honor to speak after Sam and Naomi. I love Dems abroad. I find that Dems living abroad have a really valuable awareness, more than most Americans, of the harms wrought by climate-related extreme weather disasters globally and other climate and environmental justice issues, and of the disproportionate impacts, both domestically and globally, on frontline and vulnerable communities and on the global South. I have family in Canada, Vietnam, and Poland, and served as a Peace Corps volunteer in East Africa. And I'm keenly aware of how those connections help me understand better in a visceral way, in the gut, that climate change is everywhere, and we are all in this together. And that the house is on fire is the global house. The barn's on fire and the pasture's on fire too. So, you all know that the plain truth is that we have less than 10 years now before devastating damage to our planet, and all countries, all peoples are inevitable, and in some aspects already the damage wrought is irreversible. And we also know that time has been lost, that the fossil fuel industry, which knew 50 years ago about the public health harms of combusting fossil fuels, has misled, lied, and propagandized to us all. And now here we are. And I feel, however, not the sense of close to depression and close to despair that I felt, a year ago. I feel a lot of hope right now, and there's a good reason for it. And there's an exhilarating sense that so much is happening and can happen. So many things are moving that have been stuck or broken for a long time, and that what we do now, this event, what the youth climate strike, what we do in this movement together will make the difference for generations to come. This is it. We are called to do this now. And that's why we created the DNC Council on Environment and Climate Crisis, was to bring powerful and impactful voices to the debate and to make sure that the voices were heard from the grassroots up, because we believe that policy is much better when it is informed by geographically, racially, generationally diverse sets of voices speaking about their lived experiences about the policy that we need. We also want to make sure climate never gets pushed to the back burner again. Not sure that metaphor works, but we've been engaging with activists across the country and internationally. And the thing is that we're not alone. Those of us who care about climate and environmental justice passionately and deeply, and who want to see, those of us who want to see change, have become the majority among US voters. You see signs now, we are the majority, and it's true. As has already been mentioned, we have a president who ran and won as a climate candidate. and that is a first in American history at the general election. And there's further good news, which is that there's very strong support for addressing the environmental and climate crisis, and that it's grown substantially over the last year. And I'm going to share my screen now. So someone give me like a thumbs up or pluses in the chat once you can definitely see my screen. Okay, here we go. Okay, are we good?
We're good. We can see you.
Thank you. All right. Little technical difficulty there. So the Wonderful Data for Progress has done polling that confirms what we're seeing elsewhere in other polling. So in July, 56% of voters in a very, very similar poll, similar language, didn't refer to Build Back Better because we didn't have that name then, but 56% of voters, American voters, supported creating millions of jobs and attaining clean energy. But this polling that I'm showing you is just 10 days old. And using similar language and asking about the $4 trillion plan, you can see we have 75% of all voters and 76% of independent voters supporting. And then when you turn to Republicans, actually 49% support this plan, which is a plurality of their vote. So strong support, much stronger than you might expect across the board. And you get similar when everyone, when we poll young voters, isn't surprised they support, but we get the same results in voters over 45 in a range of demographics and geographies. So we have a moment to take real meaningful action and not just to reverse the damage of Trump, but make real progress going forward. So some of the things I plan to say in some of my slides are a little bit repetitive of what has come before. So I may just kind of quickly go through a slide here or there or skip them. But, President Biden rejoined the Paris Climate Accord within hours of being in office. He ended the Keystone XL pipeline, sending a clear signal at home and abroad that the US is back. And we're again hoping to lead with our partners in addressing the climate crisis. And he followed those moves just a week later on what's being called Climate Day, January 27th, and launched a suite of other executive actions. There we go. So, some of them including ending fossil fuel subsidies that are under executive jurisdiction. Some have to be ended by Congress, so he couldn't do that. Establishing the Climate Conservation Corps, establishing a National Climate Task Force. A key aspect of this is conserving 30%, committing to conserving 30% of US land and waters by 2030. Crucial to preserving biodiversity and crucial to maintaining the existing carbon sinks that we have. So now 26% of coastal waters are already protected, but only 12% of land is preserved in its natural state. So this is going to be a big, heavy lift. It's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. But that is a short-term goal. And it was one of the things I was asked to talk about. And then another important short-term target was carbon-free electricity, carbon neutral electricity by 2035, which was a win for progressives in the climate movement that came out of the Biden-Sanders task forces. So, all of these climate touches everything, and environmental justice issues and climate issues are integrally related. So all of these things impact environmental justice. But I want to highlight a few measures that are especially important. The commitment by the Biden-Harris administration to invest 40% of federal dollars going to climate and environmental justice to the frontline communities, which are disproportionately impacted, to Black, Brown, Indigenous, and under-resourced communities. It's absolutely crucial. He's also launched a stakeholder engagement process that includes tribes and others for making major climate related decisions, and established 2 White House councils on environmental justice. So when I go back to that idea that policy needs to be informed by those most impacted, and those voices are being brought into the process, and it's not enough, but it is a crucial first step because these are the communities most impacted by extreme weather, by dirty energy extraction, by CAFOs, and are in many cases are dealing with agencies of the US government like Interior, which have a long legacy of systemic racism. So speaking of which, it's awesome that Deb Haaland has now been confirmed as Secretary of the Interior. So I'm very glad that environmental justice has been a crucial part of the president's agenda from the beginning. I think, going on to the next slide, here I've just, I think all of these people have already been mentioned, but a saying that I think is really true in the Biden administration, as other administrations, as a personnel equals policy, and it matters that Gina McCarthy, who was part of advocating for a goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius being the target goal in the Democratic Party platform last summer, that she is now the president's climate advisor and heading up the White House Office of Climate Policy. The council worked with her closely. I worked with her on getting that into the Democratic Party platform. Michael Regan is awesome at EPA, and of course, Deb Haaland at the Interior Department. I'm gonna kind of skip through some of the things I was gonna say about the Paris Agreement. But I think pretty much everything here has been said, but I was asked to talk about short-term targets. And of course, what we want are short-term targets that help us get to the long-term targets. And so if the goal is the lower target mentioned in the Paris Agreement, which is 1.5 degrees Celsius, not 2 degrees, then we need to make sure that all of the short-term targets are aligned with that. And I also wanted to just briefly point out that the states have been doing some important work related to all of this. And there are 24 states that have committed to either executive or statutory targets about reducing emissions. And so some of these are great, like Oregon has set a statutory target of reducing greenhouse gases by 45% by 2035. And North Carolina, which surprises a lot of people, has a goal of 40% by 2025. But a lot of the targets are really much more long-term oriented. My own state is on that map, Michigan, and the goal set there is net zero by 2050. So politics is politics, and we can't kick the climate can down the road. So we need those shorter term targets so we can hold the politicians currently in office responsible for them. So it is terrific news that President Biden signed on again to the Paris Agreement. And a key question is, how do we ensure that all the decisions made together by all the countries in the short term get us to that long-term goal of no more than 1.5 degrees? The linchpin of the Paris Agreement is the country's cumulative contributions to cutting fossil fuel emissions produced in their own borders. It could have been consumed, but it's produced, and works on 5-year cycles of increasingly ambitious climate action, with countries committing to certain emissions levels called NDCs, or nationally determined contributions. And as has already been mentioned, we're in that point in the 5-year cycle where the NDCs are being determined and negotiated. Those numbers have been that have been turned in by most countries, have been synthesized in an interim report that came out in February. They may still adjust those numbers, and we certainly hope that they will. But there's some things about those commitments taken as a whole. They're determined completely internally by their countries. Some of them, you look through the book, they can be fuzzy, they can be vague, and determining emissions when we're looking country to country, we often may be comparing apples and oranges. And there's no real penalty for failing to meet those targets, except that of global public opinion, which is important. But, you know, and I have tremendous faith in Gina McCarthy, who Biden's climate advisor, and that she's heading up and having a very strong voice in determining the NDC commitment for the US. And will, I know, be working to ensure that we're bold and that we account for our fair share, which is also part of the Democratic Party platform, taking into account that we've been the biggest, cumulatively, historically, the US has been the biggest emissions producer, and that the rich countries have, you know, used so much and emitted so much and are responsible for so much more proportionately and per capita of global warming than less resourced countries. So, so there's fair share in terms of our emissions cuts, as well as our fair share in terms of contributing, as Sam was talking about, to like the Green Fund and making sure that we are assisting the developing countries. So the thing is that the initial numbers that came in are not nearly good enough. To keep to 1.5 degrees, we have to decline emissions by 45% or almost half by 2030. And, you know, a 2018 UN Environmental Program report stated about the then current NDCs that they put us on a track to 3 degrees of warming. More recent science and modeling, there are models that show it could be as much as, you know, 5 or 6 degrees. So obviously we need to work to get to net zero, or my personal opinion, to near zero, actually. And so increasing numbers of scientists and policy folks and organizers are saying, Paris Agreement's good, Paris is crucial, we need to do something more. And I'm going to briefly mention some of the proposals that have come forward. There's one called that the Yale Economics and Environmental Studies professor, Nordhaus, has proposed a climate club, which I think sounds like a lot more fun than maybe it is. He says there are 2 key features of a climate club for countries that would distinguish it from previous efforts. And the first is countries would agree to undertake harmonized emissions reductions designed to meet a climate objective. And the critical difference is that those who do not participate would incur penalties. So there wouldn't just be the carrot, there would be a stick. And those penalties would sort of get us out of the prisoner's dilemma of, you know, countries that do their part, but other countries don't. The countries that don't do their part are benefiting from those that do. So another possible option to complement, again, to supplement the Paris Agreement and emissions reductions is one that looks at the supply side. And this is a treaty approach. And it's the idea is that we need a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, that unprecedented levels of international cooperation are going to be needed, just as we had to phase out stockpiles of nuclear infrastructure, and that we need to fast track it. And that the threat today is as severe as the threat of weapons of mass destruction 50 years ago. So it focuses on international agreements about dealing with emissions at the source and keeping large swaths of fossil fuels in the ground, given that, you know, already developed reserves in the US, if we actually combusted all of those fossil fuels, we would blast right through the 2-degree target, or our fair share of that. So, so there's going to be, and if you're interested in learning more about the movement for that fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, there's a website, fossilfueltreaty.org. So there's going to be a lot of movement and energy over the next month, and really for most of the rest of the year, around these issues of getting alignment of short-term targets with the generally shared global target, long-term target of 1.5 degrees Celsius. And it's awesome that there is agreement around increasing agreement about it being 1.5 degrees rather than say 2 degrees or more. And I will like to go back a little bit in my presentation, just talk a little bit about some of the things that the Climate Council has seen as really vital in terms of shorter term targets. One is getting to 100% carbon-free or net carbon-free electricity generation is important, but we also need to do that in all of our other major sectors. So transportation, agriculture, and building infrastructure. So agriculture is too often neglected when we look at reducing emissions. And so that's absolutely crucial that we get there. Trying to find my notes here. Sorry about this. Here we go. So we'd like to see targets that are not just set in 2030, but are set in 2025, so that we're holding those elected on 2 and 4 year cycles responsible for helping us to get to those goals. And we would like to see reassessment of goals more frequent than every 5 years, because the time is so short. It does take tremendous amounts of time and energy by scientists to do these assessments, but doing some kind of interim assessment every other year, we think is crucial for keeping us all on track toward a livable, green, sustainable planet, which we can do. We absolutely have the technology and the ability to achieve that. So I just also want to invite everyone to connect with the Climate Council, and there's our, follow us on Twitter, go to our website and sign up for our calls to action. So I'm gonna stop screen sharing, and unfortunately on my screen, everything was covered up. And so I didn't see any questions, but yes, thank you whoever pointed out those degrees were all in Celsius for sure. Yeah, if it were Fahrenheit, we wouldn't have such a difficulty. So thank you. And I will hand the mic back to Sam or.
I think you, yeah.
Yep,
Go
sorry.
Eric.
Thank you for the speech. It was really, really great hearing how things get done in politics, which I think it's important to remind everyone that to get things done, it requires a lot of coordination amongst a lot of different people. But of course, we have very little time with the climate movement, and so this is something that needs to be pushed. Earlier, we had Naomi present some thoughts and targets. Well, one thing that she mentioned is that we have less than 10 years. Another thing that she also brought up is the prospect of, say, a carbon tax. What are your thoughts about, I guess, two things. What are your thoughts about one, how do we make things more urgent? Can we make shorter term goals for politicians? And then second, what are your thoughts about carbon tax feasibility? Can we get this done within the next few years? Is this why we're working first with the non-proliferation?
You're muted, Michelle.
I didn't know if that was directed to me or to all the speakers, but I'm happy to jump in about politics and urgency.
Yeah, mainly you, yep.
Yeah, so, well, you're doing it. I mean, you know, all the rallies, the events, the continual reminders to politicians that this is, you know, the preeminent issue of our times, especially right now. There's so much else going on with the pandemic and its economic fallout, but keeping everyone aware that those who care passionately, deeply about climate are a growing number of people. They it's a huge issue for youth and other demographics. So that's important. And I really think that having, you know, pushing for shorter term goals is crucial, because So, in my state, there are offices like regents where they're elected for 6 years, and not all of them. And some of these people are my friends, but there are regents who it's like they get an office, and because their election's not for 6 years, it's just things that we thought would be urgent for them are not. So, and that operates even on 2 and 4 year cycles. So I think everything that you're doing and that everyone's doing, we need everyone to get involved and find their niche in the movement. That may be, voter registration. It doesn't necessarily directly related to climate, but it's just absolutely necessary for everyone to get involved and to keep letting your politicians know how important it is. And then about a carbon tax. So, I mean, we all know that carbon taxes are politically fraught, right? Washington State tried to pass one, and you had a rare instance where you had environmental justice groups and fossil fuel money on the same side against it. So, and it's happened internationally with very different dynamics. So, there isn't a carbon tax is not part of the Biden plan. And I think even Bernie Sanders backed away from a carbon tax. I suppose this is why it wasn't called a carbon tax in Naomi's talk, right? I think it is a very, very heavy lift politically, and environmental justice groups. When I talk with their representatives, what I hear is that it's a way of people getting to pay to continue to pollute. And I feel much more strongly about carbon offset strategies, so yeah, I just that's just a political reality. Did you want me to talk about anything else, or is that, and Naomi, others should jump in here.
Yeah,
I guess I just add one more thing. We tried a carbon tax in my own state of Michigan. It was a gas tax, and it was such a political disaster for my Democratic governor. Of course, this is car state, but yeah, I mean, I've seen that in action. But sorry, I interrupted, Naomi. Go ahead.
no, not at all. That's a very good point. And I agree with everything you're saying. And I mean, calling it a carbon tax for me, of course, isn't really the substantive issue, though some people would not call it a carbon tax just to get it over the hump of no more taxes. But you can look at what happened in France also with essentially a carbon tax, and it really was not, it caused huge problems among labor and among marginalized groups because it was essentially like a regressive measure. So it is politically fraught. The issue for me also on a carbon tax is that right now, the level that it's assessed at is nowhere near high enough to fund the things that a carbon tax would need to do to be useful in terms of addressing the climate crisis and to bring down emissions. It's no secret that Exxon I use Exxon a lot because I worked on the lawsuits against the fossil fuel industry, and Exxon is the major villain here. But it's not just Exxon, it's every major fossil fuel corporation. Exxon's internal price on carbon became public. So Exxon's internal price on carbon, which they assume eventually there will be some sort of tax imposed, is higher than what's been proposed by politicians. So that's where we are on the level of ambition on a carbon tax. And I think that's where a lot of opposition starts from. And then you have everything else that Michelle talked about from there that's an issue with the carbon tax. Now, in Naomi's sort of ideal world, if you slapped a $10,000 a ton price on carbon and attached it to particular fossil fuel companies who had been historically violating human rights obligations, great, let's do it. But that's the political feasibility issue.
One thing that go ahead, Sam.
Oh, I was just gonna say, the discourse on the carbon tax is becoming increasingly obsolete. You could see that in the 2016 primary, where between Sanders and Clinton, this was a central issue. Whereas 2020, when the stakes were raised with Inslee's climate plan, the idea of a carbon tax became increasingly irrelevant in terms of the discourse, in terms of what needs to be done. I mean, you have 10 years to scale back carbon emissions 50%. A carbon tax is going to have a marginal effect on that at best. So it's going to be more of a, I mean, it's going to rely less on market mechanisms to achieve what's deemed necessary by the IPCC scientists.
A related thing that the Biden administration has done is to calculate the social cost of carbon, and all federal government decisions about permitting, approvals, that sort of thing are now supposed to incorporate that cost into the models when they make decisions about what's approved. And that kind of a push, an internal government one, could also be made at the state and local government levels. So not the same thing, but gets us part of the way there, because government's a huge part of the economy.
Yeah, thank you for your comments.
Thank you, Eric, for your question. You kind of started a mini Q&A session, which is okay. So I'm going to rewind a little bit. No worries at all. We appreciate the questions and the responses from our speakers. But Michelle, it was really wonderful to hear from you. You really brought up a lot of great points. The Bronx Climate Justice North, a grassroots climate justice group, says on their website, without a focus on correcting injustice, work on climate change addresses only symptoms and not root causes. And this is absolutely true. Fighting climate change without addressing the issue of climate justice is really not a worthy fight. So we need to be sure to demand climate justice more than anything, and ensure that climate justice is at the center of all of our policies. So that being said, we're going to move into our second call to action. And don't worry, after this, we will move into a more extensive Q&A session. So have your questions prepared. But for this call to action, we hope to bring a bit of noise to the issue of climate justice using our own social media platforms. So I accidentally shared the climate strike graphic before. I didn't know it sent automatically. I'm going to send it again, and you also have received it in an email. So I hope you have this downloaded, preferably on whatever device you use to access your social media. And then we also have a pre-written text that you can post along with this graphic. So I've just sent that. Let me go back up to my script here. So when you get this pre-written text, you can copy and paste it into whatever social media platform you would prefer to use. And there's a little fill in the blank spot for you to fill out. And we ask that you fill in the blank out and really think about, why are you fighting for climate change? Why are you fighting for climate justice? Why is this issue important to you? Who are you maybe fighting for? To really share that message. Because if we were at a climate strike in person, this is also the message we would be sharing, and that we would be emanating amongst everyone who would be there with us. So I would like to take 10 minutes right now, if everyone can get on your phone or your laptop, however you access your social media platforms, and post this graphic along with this text. So on Facebook, maybe Instagram, Twitter, whatever social media you use. You can also tag Dems Abroad Youth on Instagram and Democrats Abroad Youth Caucus on Facebook. And if you're not on social media, or you'd prefer not to put it on social media, you can maybe text it to a few friends to get your voice out to them, or maybe share it on email with some people. That's also fine. However you interact with people in your life, now is really the opportunity to share this message with them. So I'm going to go ahead and mute myself, and we'll take a few minutes to all do this together. I'll check in with you in a few minutes about your progress, but please let us know. You can type in the chat if you have any questions. So let's do that together, and I'll check in with you in a few minutes. Are there any questions before, just to make sure that that's clear? No, that sounds good. Okay, then see you in a few.
Michelle, who does the posting for DNC Climate on social media?
Hi, I'm still trying to fit everything I want into this tweet. It's a fine art. I do some of it, and also this woman named Kira Gilbreth. She's actually from New Jersey. Who is from New Jersey? She worked on Artie Kreibek's campaign there. And we also have a form where people can submit suggestions to us. So we get a lot from different volunteers and members of the council who are across the US, and then we, make it fit into a tweet, which is our main way. Why are you?
I'm just scrolling
Comments
through.
or suggestions or?
No. It looks great. I like what you guys have.
Oh, thank you.
We're working on our own social media plan at the moment. Miguel is actually in leading that charge, so we're always looking for great informative pages. This is.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Because we really do work hard at it. Yeah. Yeah, we use Airtable, and then there's a form associated with that so people could submit. And we've been working hard to try and make sure that we're getting social media that isn't just the national stuff, but is really representing what's happening on the ground in people's communities. And it's also a way for people's voices to be heard. So
cool.
Good luck. Yeah, it's a lot more work than it looks like to have great social media.
We're learning. Yeah.
By the way, if everybody here can follow our page on Instagram, it's at Dems Abroad Youth, at Dems Abroad Youth. And if you want to follow me on Instagram, it's at mmadrigal0. But that's another story.
Good plug.
How's everyone doing with their posting? I'm finishing up mine now. Let us know how you're doing. Let us know if you have questions or need help.
And Michelle, what part of Michigan are you? Do you live? Where in Michigan?
I am east of Ann Arbor. There's a rural pocket, one township left between Ann Arbor and Detroit that's still rural, and we have an 80-acre farm here. So you know Michigan well.
No. No,
so I want to make sure what I said had some meaning to you. So, otherwise, I'll say not too far from Detroit.
No, but most of back in September of 2019, a delegation from Democrats abroad went to the debate, the Democratic debate in Detroit.
I was there. Were you there?
No, it was a group of Democrats abroad Canada.
So they got to stand out in the hot sun for hours waiting in line too. It was a beautiful location, the old Fox Theater, which I had never been. I think it's the Fox Theater. Yeah, I'd never been inside. Yeah. But it is a privilege to get to go to the debates for sure.
As you guys finish your post, if you could put a plus sign or something in the chat just to indicate that you're all done, that would be great, so that we could move on when we're all done posted. Great. So yeah, just update us. I don't want to take more time than is necessary, but I'll give everyone another few minutes and just let us know in the chat.
And are people aware in the Michigan State Party of Democrats abroad? Are you guys aware of us or is this like the first time you hear of us?
I think there could be greater awareness. I mean, I'm aware because at DNC conventions, I met and interacted with really wonderful people from Dems Abroad. I mean, I think I saw Martha here. And that was a privilege, and I learned a lot from that. And I talk up the importance of Dems Abroad. I did it in my social media postings for this event, talking about how Dems Abroad can be the margin in many states. And a dear friend of mine is a Dems Abroad organizer in Canada, Tim Ellis. So I hear lots about the great work that you all do, but I do think that they're continuing in greater awareness is a good thing, and you all do a good job of making sure that you're heard.
Yeah, Tim Ellis was the delegate last year. Actually, Tim and I were the two delegates from the American continent. He was representing Bernie for Canada, and I was representing Joe Biden for Costa Rica. So,
Tim's managed two of my campaigns, but he and his wife Liz they're just like very dear friends. So that's a really awesome connection to make.
All right, everyone.
and I think he's also a DJ. Oh, sorry.
Yes, he is.
Okay.
He is.
All right, so it looks like a good handful of us have gotten that posting done. If you haven't been able to get it done, feel free to do it after when you write your letter to your representative. So now I'm just gonna move into the Q&A portion of our event. So the Global Youth Caucus has a few questions from our three speakers. And we'd also like to open up the floor to the audience here. So if you have questions, star hand up in the chat, or you can ask your questions directly and we'll get to those shortly. I'll go ahead and start off with the first question, and it kind of just a panel. So Michelle, Naomi, Sam, feel free to just jump in when you feel like answering. So first question for you guys. Over the past few years, we've seen increasing energy amongst young people for climate action with movements like climate strikes. Where do you think that this generational shift in youth energy has come from, and why is it so important?
I mean, Sam, you just unmuted. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think a lot of this has been a result of a failure. I mean, with the IPCC says we got to reduce global emissions by 50%. There's no meaningful action. I mean, during the Obama years, you see a slight decline in production. That's just because, coal is being phased out of the market primarily. And now you see under Trump, you see a slight decline in emissions at the tail end of his administration due to a pandemic. There's not action being taken. There's not meaningful policy coming out under, I'm not trying both sides of it, but neither administration has really delivered what needs to be done to meet these 2030 targets. And so you've seen, all these adoptions of market mechanisms and like the NGO community promoting these, and it hasn't really translated into meaningful action and meaningful reduction. And then all these new revised nationally determined contributions, they're not sufficient. So we're not on pace to meet the 2030. There's an urgency, and it's a generation that's going to be affected that's pushing this forward. So you see movements like the Sunrise and other grassroots movements take a different approach, and hopefully this will translate into something more meaningful this time around.
Naomi, did you want to add something or?
Yeah, I mean, it's like I said at the beginning, like I'm not young, so I feel weird saying like, why is there so much youth energy in the climate crisis? And because it's weird to say like, well, I think this is why the young people are doing this. But my impression is that they've looked around and said, all right, well, your generations didn't get it done. And now we're the ones that are going to be living with this like climate hell world that we're about to inherit, which coupled with, I think, a growing awareness of how intersectional the climate crisis is and how willing the youth movements are to be about more than just climate, but all the injustices that both caused and are caused by the climate crisis. I think they're really getting their hands around just what kind of future they want. And realizing where the levers of power are right now and trying to shift it so that they don't inherit this hellscape that might come and hopefully will be less hellish for some people. That's sort of a depressing answer. And I don't mean it in the sense that people shouldn't try and that it's not inspiring to see this youth movement, because it absolutely is. And like every molecule of carbon either not put into the atmosphere or taken out right now is a win. And I think the reason that the movement has so much energy is because they realize how urgent that is.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with both of you. Absolutely. There's the lived experience. The crisis is here. A lot of times it's in people's backyards, literally or metaphorically. The science is more compelling. And I really liked what Naomi said about realizing where the levers of power. Youth are having an influence. And so knowing that what you're doing is having an impact is really reinforcing and affirming, I think. Although I'd love to hear what Alex and Sydney and Courtney think in response to my ideas. I'm not young either, about the reasons. But I also wonder about, how many people spent their teens with their parents going to rallies, that they were politically aware and in a different way than maybe people were even 10 years ago, going to Fight for 15 marches, going to Women's March rallies. So yeah.
All right. I mean, yeah, what I would think in response to, I guess I wasn't as politically conscious growing up, and my parents weren't, so I've overcompensated for the lack of that in my youth, in a lot of ways. I'd like to follow that up with a question just about, we're talking a lot about carbon emissions, but what I think we're going to learn, or what we have already learned and we're going to learn quickly, is that a lot of these carbon targets need to be in kind of lockstep with biodiversity and deforestation targets as well. I guess, so I'm doing a graduate degree in sustainability, and I have this kind of like condescending answer to like, what do people think? Like, what is the definition for like sustainability? And I'll answer saying, it's like reteaching object permanence to adults. And I'm just curious how you guys think of these kind of integrating biodiversity and forests into NDCs, and like, if there's going to be a fossil fuel non-proliferation, why not something to say, to decrease to decrease deforestation and the associated carbon risks with that, or just because they're enormous carbon stores and what. I'll stop talking.
Ooh, would it be all right if I make a couple of comments to this as well?
Please do.
So I also just finished my doctorate, my PhD in sustainable energy. I'm a bit familiar with some of the statistics, and while it is, I completely agree that deforestation is a substantial contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. It is still, I think there's still this value in prioritizing, since I think the approximate breakdown of our greenhouse gas emissions is 80% from energy, about 10% from land, and the land change and contribution to green, while the net land contribution is positive, the land contribution hasn't changed much over the past 20 or 30 years. It's unfortunate that we've destroyed so much of our environment that the continual destruction of rainforests doesn't add as much to greenhouse gas emissions. That being said, though, I do certainly agree, though, that when it comes to biodiversity and other environmental challenges that we face, yes, certainly forests and other sources of biodiversity need to be protected. But at least just in terms of the conversation of greenhouse gas emissions, I would still really put a lot of emphasis on changing our energy.
Yeah, I mean, there's just increasing research coming out about how, we're reaching a tipping point for the Amazon to turn into a savanna. And we're, finding out that there's an enormous link between the rainfall that occurs in lower Michigan and the preservation of forests in the Amazon in South America. That they're almost, pretty correlated. And I just like to see that, it needs to be like that global effort and increasing awareness of those two that are integral.
Yeah, or rather, if I can take, and now it's turning into another question session. But
no,
I guess
this is it. We're in the question session. Don't worry.
Okay. Let me let me rephrase what I said, because I think I need to correct a couple of things that I said. So by no way am I saying that our rainforests need to be that don't need to be protected, and in no way am I saying that this is extremely important. I think, though, perhaps the main interest is that we should look at where we at our supply chain. We need to look at where how the industrialized world gets their materials, how energy is being distributed, where does energy come from, and I think a lot of these things aren't as transparent as they should be. And perhaps some increase in transparency can go a long way, rather than just directly trying to save the rainforest directly. I think you can end up doing a lot of the same things through other ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I know that Sam has gone to the COP, the Conference of the Parties climate meet. I know that there's going to be a COP for biodiversity coming up. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that. Sam, yeah.
Yeah, I guess this year's COP, I mean, there still remains a lot to be seen.
Mm-hmm.
In one sense, global emissions fell significantly last year as a result, but in terms of international climate policy, we essentially lost a year. I think last time I checked, just over a dozen countries have resubmitted their revised pledges. This was supposed to be the year for ambition. This was the year where everyone was supposed to resubmit and meet the 2050 goals and get to 1.5 degrees, but we essentially lost a year of the pandemic. And now there's all sorts of talk with, this is going to be a virtual COP, is this going to be a mixed? If it's a mixed COP, does that mean that, the delegates will all be vaccinated? Does that mean that, delegates from the developing world will not have to be represented because they won't be vaccinated in time? So you could see just like the global inequalities play out in this year's COP. And this could be disastrous in a lot of ways, because this is probably the most important COP since the Paris Agreement, COP 21, 2015. And civil society might be shut out. They might have this reduced sessions. It might be on Zoom's part of it. And much of the world's could be locked out, depending on how quickly the world can overcome this pandemic. So I think there's just a lot to be seen. And, we've seen the US kind of be actively hostile under both Republican and Democratic administrations in terms of taking responsibility for historical loss and damage, and taking into account for historical emissions. And from Trump to Obama, the negotiators on loss and damage and taking into account remain the same. And if these people are locked out of the COP, if the developing world remains unrepresented at COP21, I think this could be disastrous, and it could give the current administration a chance to get out of taking some serious responsibility, as well as much of the developed world is responsible for the historical emissions.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. Well said. I'm going to stick back with the script here. Sydney, I think you have a question for our speakers.
Yeah. So obviously COVID is something weighing heavily on everyone's mind right now. How would you think that this pandemic has and will continue to influence the future of the environment and environmental policy?
I'll jump in on that. I think COVID has shined a stark and completely deservedly unflattering light on how broken systems are in the US and in many other countries on the public healthcare system, our procurement and supply chain, even our ability to respond to any kind of disaster, the education system, student debt. I mean, like climate, it has, it affects everything. And the US just has a broken support system from birth to grave. And I think it's also sharpened and increased existing disparities in income and wealth, disproportionately impacting a lot of the same people who are already disproportionately impacted by climate environmental issues. People of color, under-resourced communities, women, youth. And I think that it has been helpful. I mean, I don't want to call it even a silver lining, but it has made those issues clear, and to the extent that they are going to get addressed by the Biden administration, and many are already, that I think will be helpful going forward for environment and climate policy. And it looks like Sam wants to jump in.
I was just going to say it represents a golden opportunity. First of all, they can tie basically anything to COVID for the next 2 years. And there's 2 more opportunities to do reconciliation. So they only need a 50-50 vote. And then if they do filibuster reform, present more. And then Biden's Build Back Better plank, tying this, and he's going to try and tie this all to infrastructure. So it's going to it presents a golden opportunity, whether they take advantage of it, whether they use it, because this reconciliation package, I think, only really had $100 million reserved, and that was primarily towards environmental justice issues. But I think he's going to tie it to this Build Back Better plan, tie it to infrastructure. So it presents, a really good opportunity for them to push this legislation through. And we'll see if he does it.
Yeah, my only additions I agree with what Michelle and Sam said, is 2 things. A lot of that comes back to the previous question about youth energy. It will go as far as demands go. Environmental policies and environmental laws, like, excuse me, don't necessarily start off great in these kinds of bills, and then they get chipped away at by a very recalcitrant right wing. So it's really important to start them off as progressive, as radical, as left as possible, so that what you end up with in this recovery packages for the next couple of years is somewhat close to what is necessary, and that will come from activism and from demanding it, from advocating for it. And there are, of course, some champions in Congress and in the administration now as well, which is helpful. And then the other thing I would add is that it's not a foregone conclusion. Fossil fuel companies, coal companies, insurance companies sort of made out like bandits under the Trump Recovery Act. They were able to suck up a lot of that relief money, a lot of that insurance money, a lot of that aid that should have gone to almost anybody else that needed it more. And so they will be looking for every handout they can get from industries on down. And so that's something to guard against too, in thinking about what COVID will do for environmental policy.
Yeah, thanks for those great responses. And strangely enough, in these difficult times, it has kind of presented us with an opportunity, right? Before Eric gets to your question, I just wanted to make sure and let everyone know this is our final call for questions. So if you have any questions, would like to say something, please let us know now so that Eric can get on with his question, and then we can end the session. So last call for any questions, just type in the chat. Otherwise, Eric, you're free to ask your question for now.
Thank you, and so sorry for being the only one asking questions here.
Don't be sorry. Your input is definitely.
It's all right. I'm new to politics. Perhaps I'll refine my interaction later. But yeah. So I quick comment on. I agree that there's a lot of different approaches to introducing policy and making change happen, and Naomi, you're making a comment about how it's important to introduce really as much stringent and liberal policies as we can, because it'll be cut down anyway. I don't have a solution, but my comment is kind of more of a recent concern, particularly amongst youth. And that's that there's so many people that feel disenfranchised by policy, particularly that it feels as if we make a bunch of, we rile up people, we make a bunch of promises, and then it doesn't happen. Again, I don't have a solution, but is there some other sustainable way of introducing policy in a way that I know Joe Biden, for instance, when he started his term, he was saying, okay, I'm going to have 100 million people with the coronavirus, and that was a very mild 100 million, 1 million vaccines per day. And that was a very mild target, and some people criticized them for that. So I understand that perhaps going the opposite direction isn't good. But is there a way to make more sustainable policy introduction rather than doing something that might disenfranchise people? Or make people disillusioned? Sorry.
I mean, it's hard to answer that, because for every person that's disillusioned by the radical policy that was proposed not happening, there's the same person who thinks, oh, like getting this far is a win. So it's not the same for every person. So it's hard to like say, well, this is the wrong way to do it, or this is the right way to do it. I mean, there's also the point that like policy isn't everything, especially federal policy isn't everything. That's one piece of a million little things that have to get done to solve the climate crisis. So you know, it can be disappointing when a Green New Deal doesn't pass in Congress, but that doesn't mean there isn't policy happening at the local level. There's not fracking bans happening all over the Northeast. There's not, et cetera, that are local wins, local environmental justice wins. So, but like there was I think it was the Obama administration, who I am no fan of on energy policy at all, but they would say, get caught trying. And I think that's the prescription for like bold policy, which is like, at least you set it out there. And I think there's been some analysis on Obamacare, which is that they were too conservative even in what they proposed. And then Obamacare got chipped away at, and now it's got to be fixed. If you had just proposed, you know, universal healthcare, and you had ended up with something like what Biden is doing now, you might have had more people on board. But my original point is that you're never going to please everybody with how policy is proposed and how it's passed. So what's the greatest good for the greatest number of people? It's a big country. People have a lot of different opinions on that.
Yeah.
And I want to add something related to what I've talked about before, which is, you know, I do think that it is important that at the federal, state, and local levels, that policymakers and electeds are listening and informing their policy decisions but by what they have heard. And those may be in smaller marginal ways, but ways that matter greatly to how policy actually impacts people. And so process matters. And I've been really pleased to see the White House is and other parts of the administration are really reaching out to you know, leaders in environmental justice groups, leaders of climate action groups, and holding meetings with them. And the DNC under the new chair is Jamie Harrison has now, you know, he's very strongly supportive of the kind of work that the Climate Council has been doing on our own without financial support from the DNC, and that there are other caucuses and councils have been doing that work too, and is working to increase the number of state environmental caucuses and councils, for example. We're going to have support for doing that. So I see that happening, and I'm hopeful that that is, you know, modeling what we hope we'll see more in more states and local governments, many of which have been already doing this kind of outreach, but definitely not all. And so that would be my answer, is that process matters. It matters to policy, and that to the greater extent people are engaged in it, the more they understand how it turns out.
I think also it's just important to note that, you know, I think the climate movement does have Biden's ear, and I don't know if that was so apparent in previous administrations. Instead of Ken Salazar, you have Deb Haaland in terms of as your Secretary of Interior. You have these massive shifts, and you see, you know, you see members of the Sunrise Movement being put on joint task force teams. You see a lot of massive changes underway. So I do think that there's this has a bit of a different feel to it. And you don't see the type of appointments in the past where you have people who are actively hostile to the climate movement, people who are pro, pushing forward the Keystone Pipeline, people who are building up the oil and gas industry. Those people are largely gone. And certain members, especially, I think the Chief of Staff, Ron Klain, they have an ear to the left, they have an ear to the climate movement. And I think that there's an opportunity that's presented itself that hasn't been there, even if that wasn't readily apparent on the campaign trail. I think that how it's playing out right now is quite different.
All right. So we're going to close out here. A very big thank you to our guests today, Sam, Naomi, Michelle. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us for our virtual climate strike and to answer a few of our questions. Thank you everyone for joining us as well. Climate change is clearly more than just an environmental issue. It's also a social issue, a racial justice issue, a human rights issue, an economics issue, a public health issue. And while it's critical that we've joined the Paris Agreement, we must start making larger strides to tackle the climate crisis and the idea of justice and equity at the forefront. Many thanks to everyone who joined the call. We appreciated your questions and look forward to seeing you on our future calls. Please visit our page. I'll put it in the chat. It's democratsabroad.org/YC. And it's very easy to just join our membership by clicking join at the top there. Now, Courtney has some last bits of information before we actually wrap up here.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. I hope you all have really enjoyed our virtual climate strike, and another huge thank you to our speakers. It was so exciting having so many people join us today. Climate change and climate justice really must be our top priorities moving forward, and tackling these issues will be no small feat, but I really believe and I hope that as we continue to make our voices heard and as we continue to pressure our leaders, we will see the change. So don't forget to contact your representatives after this, immediately after, while everything is still fresh in your mind. And like Sophie said in her video at the beginning, if we all get together and we make our voices heard, we can't and we won't be ignored. We demand climate change, and I hope you all will continue to join us as the Global Youth Caucus in this fight. Before we end the call, we ask that you use the donation link. We'll send it again in the chat box to make a donation of any size that you can so that we continue to do this great work and bring more events like this to you. We would be very grateful to have your support. And with that, we're going to be ending this call and stopping the recording. So thank you to our speakers. Thank you for joining us. Let's fight for climate justice and climate action together. Thank you.
And yes, thank you, Sophie, so much for that wonderful video.
Alex, I think you're good to stop the recording, just so you know.
Yep.